State legislatures across the country are now ground zero in the debate over GMO, or genetically modified food. While there's no evidence of significant health risks, some environmental groups disparage GMOs as frankenfoods, and they're pushing states to enact mandatory labeling of foods containing GMO ingredients. Joining me, as she does most Thursdays, is WGBH News science editor Heather Goldstone. Welcome.
Good to be here.
So, genetic foods covers a lot of territory. Give me some examples of what is modified.
Well, so a genetically modified organism is essentially something that couldn't be made by conventional breeding or hybridization. It has to involve some sort of direct genetic manipulation in order to create the end product. And at this point, they're a lot more common than you might think. So some of the top modified crops in the United States: corn, soybeans, sugar beets, and as you can see here, the percentage of those crops that are genetically modified at this point, at least when they're grown in the United States, is overwhelming. Over 90% of the corn, of the soybeans, of the sugar beets that we're growing in this country are genetically modified at this point. And so what that translates into when you go to the grocery store is over 70% of processed foods, things like cereals, of course, canola oil coming directly from the genetically modified canola, and then even things like cheese and dairy products where it may not be the actual cow itself, because the vast majority of animals and animal products are not genetically modified at this point, but they're being fed genetically modified organisms. And so in terms of those that are fighting against genetically modified foods or want them labeled, those products often count.
All right, so what would the labels look like? What would it say?
Well, I think that's a big question. So despite the fact that there's no requirement for the labeling at this point, market forces are driving companies to start to do this. And actually, about a week ago, the maker of Cheerios announced that original flavor of Cheerios will be, from here on out or starting soon, genetically modified organism free, GMO free. And so they've got this big label there. And I think a lot of the labels in this country, the voluntary labeling that has gone on to this point, has involved these rather large, essentially, disclaimers saying GMO free, as you can see in these examples. But in Europe, where labeling is actually required, it's a much more subtle thing. So in that case, it's just part of the ingredients list that instead of simply saying soybean oil, as in this case, it says genetically modified soybean oil. But there's still a lot of debate, even if you can find people that agree on the idea of labeling genetically modified foods. How much information you get in those labels is really unclear, and especially with the fact that right now in the United States, there's no federal mandate. The FDA has declined to require labeling, so it's happening at the state level. And even like here in Massachusetts, we've got 4 different bills that are currently sitting in committee with different requirements. It could be a whole host of different things that they might require. In one case, I think one of the bills actually requires that if a food contains an organism that had a gene from another species inserted into it, you have to disclose the species and the gene that was put in there. In other cases, it could simply be that a gene was deleted. And so there's a level of information that, if you're just looking at an ingredient list, isn't actually getting onto that label.
The state-by-state thing is going to end up being a morass, but some of the states have already done it. Well, what's in their laws? Well,
so Connecticut was the first. It was signed into law late last fall, and now Maine has also passed a law. But the catch with both of those is that those laws don't actually go into effect until more states create laws like that. They have what's called a trigger. So in the case of Connecticut, there have to be 4 more states that sign, that create such laws. At least one of them has to share a border with Connecticut, and they have to represent in total a certain number of people. And the idea there is kind of safety in numbers, because states are really concerned about the cost of lawsuits, and also the fact that essentially, if it's just one small state that passes a law like this, food companies could essentially just opt out of selling food in that state, and 70% of the processed food disappears from your grocery stores.
So I can understand people wanting to know, fair labeling and all that, but the bottom line is, are genetically modified foods safe?
Well, that's clearly the question still. In terms of, is there a scientific consensus? There was a large study by Italian scientists last year who looked at close to 1,800 different scientific studies and said There is no evidence of any significant harm or health risk. The American Medical Association, the American Association for the Advancement of Science, the National Academies of Science have all essentially put out statements saying we can find no evidence that there's any problem with these. But there are still a lot of concerns. And so, there are even proponents of genetically modified organisms who say we should do the labeling simply so that people can get over the fear, realize that these are common, that they've already been eating them, and that they're not a problem.
It's a good idea. All right, Heather Goldstone, as always, thanks for coming in.